Good morning, good day if you're in other parts of the world. I've called this, To What Extent Should Online Exams Resemble Written Exams? And it includes input from my colleagues Igor and Ollie at Manchester. Looking at the IMA Statement on methods of assessment in the mathematical sciences, a few quotes come out. The need for university level assessments to include invigilated on-campus exams and closed book assessments, as well as assessment that is appropriate to the relevant discipline. We want to assess in a way that's relevant for maths. I'd like to take a look at some recent exam questions, or in one case a coursework question, and ask, how would we assess this electronically? In some cases we did. Of course it would be very rash for me to say we would never assess this electronically. We're making more and more progress as a community. Each year more and more things are becoming available. A question here about continuous odd functions and local maxima and minima involved sketching, and possibly for that reason was done on paper, also wanting to see what the justification is that the students would give. Of course, I'm well aware that justification and sketches are indeed possible electronically. There may come a time for the step up here. This particular function, it would seem, yes, you could add a bit of randomization to it, but it might not add a great deal as randomization. Another one done on paper recently has been asking students to draw a sketch of the derivative from a particular function. Again, with sketches involved, the decision was taken that yes, this should be assessed on paper, but of course we don't rule out possible developments in the future. Most of the question here about cylindrical polar coordinates, parts B and C here, could indeed quite easily be done electronically, and in fact questions equivalent to B and equivalent to C have indeed been assessed as part of coursework or in other recent exams. There are several MAL rules that come out quite clearly that can be applied there. But it's probably because of the presence of point A. For several years, yes, many of the example sheets that students carry out start with a question asking them to write down a few points about a particular topic there. I believe that maybe one of the first things students need to do for a topic is a bit of summarization. Summarization in their own words. But for the first time, I've actually put this in an exam, so I wanted to keep this part here, which would be done on paper, next to parts B and C on the particular topic there. I could have made more use of the hybrid options, but I kept it as it was here. Well, we can see that the question asked here was indeed carried out electronically. This has, of course, a stack look about it. This was a question asked about even functions for students, and perhaps they could have predicted that a question like this might come up, given that they were given a practice paper with something not too different involving odd functions. And this, of course, is an example of a question that doesn't have a unique answer. There are many functions f of x that satisfy the two conditions here, as well as being even functions. Possibly we could say, well, there's going to be one optimal answer, one that satisfies the conditions, is an even function, and is a polynomial of minimum order, in this case a quadratic. But of course there's nothing particularly special about polynomials here. This question could also be answered with an appropriate cosine function, with a quartic function, with all sorts of other functions that satisfy things. It might be a somewhat difficult one for a human marker to mark, and if I had been charged with marking this by hand, probably I would have set up a routine that I could feed the various conditions into, various things about the function that the students give, to see, does it satisfy that it's an even function? Does it satisfy the conditions here? And in essence, by doing so, I would simply be carrying out the various rules that I had programmed into the system in order to carry out the very same marking operations. So I'd call this one a good one to work with electronically. Similarly, we can see that this particular one has been asked electronically, and I include it because one thing that I was doing with this question, in an attempt to make it slightly easier for the students, at least to give them slightly higher marks, actually backfired on me. If we just consider the top half of the blue here, where we're asking students to find the value of C in a particular straight line, that yes, it's a fairly involved calculation, but there is a unique answer that the students can put in, and the various properties of this answer would be tested, for example, against the correct answer, but there's a few other things that we can test it against. But then I put in the values of x and y where this tangent line crosses another line here, simply because I wanted that even if the students had made a bit of a hash of this first part, but they had an answer, I'd find some way of just giving them a few marks for something else there. But as it turned out, many of them just missed out this last part, whether or not they felt that they had spent enough time on this question and would go to other questions and so on, that they ended up missing out some of the low-hanging fruit. With some of those questions, I did make reference to randomization. And of course, a valid question is, why include randomization in an invigilated exam? Now, it is true that in the majority of invigilated exam clusters there are buffers between the desks, but I know that some colleagues are still worried that there could exist lines of sight, and that these lines of sight may end up impinging on other people's screens in a perpendicular rather than oblique and almost zero angle with the actual screen there. Of course, questions can be prepared with a significant amount of randomization and can be pared down to a smaller number of variants, maybe even one variant, when the time comes. When considering if assessment should be written or online, we can see some of the pros and cons for written exams here. We can see some of the pros and cons for online exams here. But we also need to consider a hybrid option. Now, a hybrid option could take several different forms. It could be that you have different exams at different times, with no link between the questions. It could be that you have the same exam time frame. Students can work on written work at some point, online work at another point during this time frame. It might be that you put some kind of limitations on one or other of the components. You do indeed have the ability to link the various questions from the online and written parts. Or, of course, you can design an online exam with some of the questions involving something that's going to be answered and then looked at by a human marker. When we're comparing written and online assessment, we probably will remember that the use of paper is something that's gone on for a long time. But that doesn't make it the prime form. That's the way it is, partly due to the availability of paper and so on. There are many aspects of written assessment that are worth aspiring to emulate when you're looking at online materials, but not just because they're written there. The ability to ask questions without a single answer, for example, that's something where e-assessment really comes into its own. What we will give towards paper is the fact that, yes, many of the cosmetics have been developed for good reasons. The fact that the page numbering and the mark totaling and so on, that's the kind of thing we would do well to emulate when we're going on to computerized work. But what about the questions themselves? Well, probably I would advise against ultra-long questions. If you have several questions dependent on each other, not only do you have to make your decision trees longer within themselves, but you have to link the various decision trees. But sometimes it's possible to ask sub-questions that are less related to each other. So we can see here that we have parallelogram ABCD, we're given information, we're asked for the position vectors for B, C, and D, and yes, this feeds into both part 2 and part 3, but what you will notice that part 2 and part 3 are independent. A is given, C is used in part 2, it's B and D that are used in part 3. So that means just a little bit less of the linking of decision trees, so perhaps that little bit more can go into the development of the decision tree for each part. Okay, hopefully we've seen various reasons to use written, online, or indeed hybrid exams here. I would say let the maths and the practicalities dictate the form of examination that you use. But don't feel you have to veer towards something that looks similar to written assessment just because that's what's been used for a longer period of time. Thank you for watching.